You're listening to episode 107 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Humanist Contemplative D.T. Strain joins us to talk about being a humanist minister in Texas. Today there is a wonderful opportunity to take advantage of the attitudes and approaches to life we secular Buddhists have in common with other groups with whom we don't always directly engage. This includes people who may self-identify as atheists, skeptics, and secular humanists. And as we do make those connections, we can learn from one another and discover how having a rich and diverse body of views can complement our own without sacrificing our core practices. One of the challenges we face, however, is striking the balance between respect and even admiration for one another while not crossing over into becoming accommodationist. This is particularly true of the new concept of humanist ministry, a seeming oxymoron, but no more than secular Buddhism. D.T. Strain is a humanist minister, certified by the American Humanist Association, and is a spiritual naturalist. His Humanist Contemplative group and concept has since helped inspire a similar group at Harvard University, and he is former president of the Humanists of Houston. D.T. has appeared as a panelist on the Houston PBS television program The Connection, discussing religious belief and non-belief, and speaks at a number of other venues upon request. He's an enthusiast of Stoicism, Buddhism, and other ancient philosophies, seeking to supplement modern scientific and humanistic values with these practices. As such, he often attends the Jade Buddha Temple, writes on Stoicism, and organizes the Humanist Contemplatives Houston Meetup Group. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice Japanese single malt, Yoichi. And our guest today is D.T. Strain. Daniel, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Very glad to talk with you about things, and what I'd like to start off with, and we'll get a little bit more into some of the interesting topics we were just discussing that we'd like to talk about. I'd like for you to tell us about your background, and in particular, how you arrived at the place you are now.
Well, my name is D.T. Strain, and I am a humanist minister, and even a lot of humanists aren't aware of what a humanist minister is. But basically, I grew up in a conservative Christian family, and at some point, just after my college years, I decided that I didn't really subscribe to those beliefs, and I thought I had invented humanism and all that other people believed the same things. And then I found out it was called humanism, and I said, okay, I guess I'm a humanist. And
I thought the same thing about secular Buddhism, and then I read one of Stephen's books. I'm like, damn it, it wasn't me.
Yeah, well, that's the thing about true ideas, is that people tend to discover them, not invent them.
Right.
Anyway, I found other people who had found the same territory, and I was very excited about that, so I got involved in the humanist organizations, and I went through my phase of, this mission to bring down religion kind of phase that a lot of people go through after they come to those beliefs. And um, after a while, though, I became a lot more concerned with what do I believe and not what I don't believe. And so humanism was very positive for me and everything, and I still consider myself a humanist in every way. But one thing about humanism is that it's a somewhat general philosophy, and I mean modern humanism with a capital H. And there's really two aspects to it. One is that uh, it is naturalistic. It doesn't have supernatural elements to it or faith-based elements. Um, and a subset of the naturalistic is that we derive our beliefs through observation, experience, evidence. And the second part to it, which is really the important part, is compassion and concern for your fellow human being. And so, if you read the Humanist Manifesto, the most recent one, Manifesto 3, there's 6 general points. And I don't need to go over them here, but the point is that it's a very general thing. It can fit on one side of one sheet of paper, basically. Now, you compare this to the Pali Canon in Buddhism, and got quite a disparity of volume of information. Now, there's certainly a lot of humanist writers who have contributed a lot of very noble and worthy things to humanism, but I feel like humanism is a good start, but when it gets down to an individual level, living your life day by day, and needing some sort of guides and wisdom and what have you, that humanism has a long way to go and could use a lot of help in filling out the rest of it, of that detail, into a more full kind of life practice. And so that's kind of what I focus on. And to do that, I I try to bring together what modern science tells us about the way the world is with a compatible set of practices and principles that are derived from wisdom from all over the world and throughout history, and that makes sense in a modern context. And so Buddhism is one of those philosophies that the more I've investigated it and the more I've learned about it and studied it and written about it, the more I've found that it really has a good set of ideas that are very compatible with the modern understanding of the way our world works through as a naturalistic scientific understanding of the world. Um, and by the way, let me jump back a little bit. I said I was a humanist minister. Humanist minister is someone who I'm certified by the American Humanist Association to basically I perform weddings and funerals and things like that. So basically, I'm a secular celebrant, and um, that's pretty much all a humanist minister is. I don't carry any special authority or keys to ultimate truth or anything like that. But so anyway, what I've done over the past 7 or 8 years has been a very careful study of Buddhism and of things like Stoicism, Taoism, writings of Heraclitus, Socrates. I've taken a lot of these different concepts and philosophies and analyzed them for, first of all, doing some comparative studies. Where do they overlap? Where are they similar? Where do they contradict and why? And then coming up with a system that is very much compatible with the modern naturalist viewpoint. And so I do consider myself a Buddhist in that sense. And I think a lot of people misunderstand Buddhism because there's a lot of different Buddhisms. There's a lot of different flavors of it, and it's taken on a lot of different uh, packaging depending on what part of the world it's in. But anyway, so that's what I've been working on, and my website is thehumanistcontemplative.org. And there I have, my writings. I have some links to some other writings, and um, I also there's a blog attached to it where I write about relevant concepts in that vein.
I get a couple questions for you on some of the background things that you were talking about, and one of those is that you'd mentioned that sometime after college is when you kind of got to the point where you were aware that this just the traditional upbringing that you had wasn't quite gelling with you anymore. Was there anything specific leading to that, or was just a general examining of what it said not resonating with you?
Well, a lot of people, that's a very good question. It's a reasonable question to ask because a lot of people do have these moments in life that make them question things and what have you. But for me, it was, I guess, a little weird. I can remember the exact moment I became an atheist and what direction I was facing and where I was standing.
A lot of us can't. I want to hear your story.
And it wasn't because of, if you had seen a video of this event, it would just be me standing there.
Yeah, yeah.
But what happened was that it was part of a long process of, I can't complain. I don't have any story of some priest that hit me over the head or some preacher that was a jerk to me or anything like that that happened. I wasn't oppressed in any way. I didn't have any kind of like trauma in my life. I've actually been very fortunate. I had a very good life. My family, even though we had different beliefs, my mother and father were great parents. I had a wonderful family, a very good upbringing. So it wasn't any kind of a situation like that. It was purely an intellectual thing that began with a friend of mine questioning me during high school. And from there, that kind of like planted the seeds. And throughout all of college, I was not in a worried or aggravated way, but almost as a hobby, just in my mind, going through these questions and reading things and thinking about them and processing them and deciding what I believed. And I went through these different stages, and it was uh, a very systematic sort of tackling of all these different issues. And I remember, and by systematic, I mean that I would think of one issue, I would say, okay, well, that's what seems to be right there. And then I'd move on to the next issue, almost like an outline. And the moment I became an atheist was the moment I, I kind of finished the previous issue that I'd been working through, which then, of course, that leads to the premise of another argument, the foundation of the next step, and that sort of thing. And my mind reached out for the next item on the agenda, and there wasn't any. And I don't mean to imply that I knew everything at that point. I certainly didn't. And I had a lot more to learn after that, which is all the stuff we're going to be talking about today. Um, but as far as the God question goes, or the faith question goes, um, I had not seen anything else to make me wonder anything other than the position I had arrived at, which is that, it really makes a lot of sense to be humble in our approach to knowledge and to only believe things are true when we have some kind of evidence to believe they're true, and to leave them as simply unknown if they're not knowable or if we don't have knowledge of that.
Yeah, yeah.
And so once I reached that conclusion, there wasn't a lot of reason to go through all of the arguments about, you know, Leviticus or things like that, because, that really just hit to the foundation of all of the Abrahamic religions. And from there on, and the very next question after that moment was, okay, well, then what do I believe? And that's where I began my piecing together of what I'd find out later was called humanism.
Interesting. Now that's a really familiar story, actually. The not having a particular single event, but really a culmination of things leading to a realization. And sometimes it's an aha, and sometimes it's a oh yeah.
Hmm.
For many of us, we have different kinds of experiences that led to that. So thank you for sharing your story on that one. And you had mentioned also earlier that you went through what I think many atheists that those of us know who are active in the atheist community may know someone like this, may be someone like this, may have been someone like this, is that you went through a rejection phase. You went through the angry bringing down religion phase because of that letdown, that disappointment, that um, it not living up to what the expectations are that it advertises for itself. How did you get through that? What did you do? Was that a matter of time, or are there specific things that helped you get past it?
Well, you know, I I had something going for me in that, like I said, the very next question I asked was, "What do I believe?" So I didn't actually have a strictly atheist phase and then move into humanism. Humanism is a pretty positive worldview when it's expressed correctly and practiced correctly, as what it really is. And so I was already kind of, heading in the right direction, I think, looking back on it. But I, nevertheless, a big part of my activity in the humanist organizations was very much aimed at things like, fighting in God we trust on the money,
Yeah, yeah.
and uh, concern with court cases and protesting football games where they're going to have a public prayer and things like that. And I don't mean to downplay the importance of the separation of church and state, or the importance of those who aren't theists having equality in society. Those are important points, but
Yeah, yeah.
that's not what I would necessarily call humanism. Um, that would be something that I today think would be more apt for a strictly atheist organization, or for an organization that brings in lots of people, like say the Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, which
Yeah.
also includes religious people. But for a humanist organization, I tend to think it would be better for a humanist organization to focus on things like um, poverty, or education, and things that really help human beings, and things that really help uh, the less fortunate, and compassionate driven things. And so I still think that a lot of organized humanism is still kind of stuck in that mode. And one of the reasons is because we don't have a lot of these more detailed uh, volumes of wisdom to deal with. Buddhists are, of course, atheists in the sense that uh, they don't have a deity in the sense that the Abrahamic religions do, or even in the sense that pagan religions do. And yet they enjoy a respect and camaraderie among people of other faiths and people in the community, and it's because they spend their time talking about Buddhism and practicing Buddhism, more importantly, and not spending their time poo-pooing some other belief system, or telling other people what they should or shouldn't do, or shouldn't believe. They lead by example. That's what humanism, I think, really needs to really can learn from Buddhism, is to we need to start talking about humanism rather than what we're not.
What we're not for. Yeah, and that's always been one of the challenges that, as an atheist, and my first kind of toe in the water of some of the organizations that are ideologically in alignment, I'll say, is that the the atheist side tended to spend a lot of time with the the negative attacks on religious assertions. And I understand challenging naturalistic claims that are not in evidence. I get that. But that was a preponderance of the activity rather than some of the things that which they do, like blood drives and things like that. But that was a minor point. That was a,
Mhm.
we're really, really, in some cases, I've seen a great deal of negativity, and sometimes it's called for when there are gross injustices or things that are dangerous to people. Praying for someone who has a treatable illness that is caused by infection and the bacterial
Yeah.
understanding of disease, and we're going to pray for that's bad. And I agree that that should be very passionately fought against. But we need to really turn around the positive. There's not a positive proposition of atheism. That's what I keep looking for.
Yeah. Well, this is also really a question of compassion for not only for the believer, but compassion for the atheist, in that, you fill your life with that kind of negativity, and it can really impact the quality of a person's life. And the thing that Buddhism is great at teaching is that um, taking action in the world to improve the world can, and even taking action in opposition to certain other people or groups, can be done in a compassionate way with a good inner disposition, pure motivation. And when it's done that way, it doesn't impact the strength or the effectiveness of the action in the
Right,
world.
right, right.
And so understanding that is really a crucial step. And that once somebody understands that you can act even vigorously for important causes and yet maintain a compassion for all beings, that is, it's a challenge. But that teaching and seeing glimpses of that in your life as you go, that's really an important step, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And you'd also mentioned earlier something that comes up fairly frequently in online discussions, sometimes in person, that claims that are religious claims, ones that we don't have direct evidence that we can repeatedly test and are predictive, that really we just can't go into those. We have no frame of reference to discuss them. They're supernaturalistic as opposed to naturalistic. And that I would suppose that at a level of intellectual honesty, sure, to be technically correct, we have to be agnostic about that because we're willing to be convinced if given evidence.
Mhm.
But really, that doesn't quite cover it. It's not really fully honest about it that we're atheist about these. Do you ever get into those discussions where someone says, "Oh, so you're agnostic," and have that feeling of, so you're halfway to being faithful and you can be saved? And how do you deal with that?
Yeah, there's a lot of different impressions people have about the word agnostic, and I kind of have moved away from using the word agnostic and atheist and all that. I just use naturalist. And what I focus on is I say, well, here's what I believe, here's what I see around me and everything. If you ask me about other things, I'll say, well, I wouldn't know anything about that. I've never had any experience of that. I don't know that. Now, if they say, I certainly don't want to give the impression that I consider it 50-50 that any and all stories about the cause, our ultimate causes are all just 50-50. I don't look at it that way, but I think that it's not unlike how a person thinks about anything. Like, for example, um, it's possible there could be listening devices planted in my house, or video devices planted in my bathroom. But unless I see some indication of that, the normal response is just to kind of proceed as though it's not the case. And so that's really no different than anything else than with the whether it's supernatural or natural isn't the point. The point is um, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and if you don't have the evidence, you just pretty much assume that that's not the case until you get some indication that it is.
Quoting Carl Sagan will only make you more friendly to this podcast, so thank you for that.
Yeah, I crediting him. I sometimes just assume my audience knows what I'm talking
And many, I think a lot of the listeners do at this point know that quote because we've used it several times.
about.
They may not be as familiar with some of what you're describing is Russell's teapot, and it's the, let's, and this is from quite some time ago, imagining that there's a teapot halfway between Earth and the sun. We can't really show it. So what? What it doesn't really impact what we do moment by moment.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
this really segues into kind of the next step I took after that, which was moving into after the humanist kind of stuff, moving more into this, coming up this concept of the humanist contemplative. And there's certain key elements that denote what is meant by this concept called the humanist contemplative. Um, One of them is, and all of these come out of different ways of thinking about and talking about humanism. And one of them has to do with the epistemology, our empirical approach to knowledge. And, um, a lot of times humanists, the first thing they'll say is, well, we don't believe this, we don't believe that, um, you know, that kind of thing. I tried to move away from making the very first thing I say be what I believe is not your thing, and so um, I kind of took the concept of uh, empirical approach to knowledge and turned it on its head. And instead, I think we need to come at this from a different point of view, thinking again about that pure motivation stuff and having a compassionate motivation. And when you come at it from that angle, then really the first thing you're talking about when it comes to knowledge is humility. And so I prefer to talk about knowledge in terms of a humble approach to knowledge, humility when it comes to knowledge. And that means that we don't, we try to be care as a spiritual value, as a practice, as a part of uh, our spirituality, our life practice, our humanist practice. One of those values, one of those principles is a humble approach to knowledge, which means that we don't try to tell others or ourselves that we know things that we really don't know. We try to be very humble. And I think accenting that note on humility is important. And I don't just mean in a PR sense. I'm talking about it's important for us because when we start talking about it in those terms, it makes us think about it in those terms, that we internally practice it in those terms. And that can be very important because, as you know, an atheist can be um, very, what's the opposite of humility? Um,
Arrogant.
Arrogant as well, so the opposite problem can occur too. So it's important for us to be humble with our approach to knowledge. That's one element of the humanist contemplative concept. Another element of the concept, and this really comes first, is I started to think about what humanism is really based on, and I mentioned the two things about the one factor of the naturalism and the other factor of the compassion. And really, you think about the fact that we talk about science and we talk about reason and we talk about um, uh, rationality and reason-based thinking, and we talk about those a whole lot, and we talk in a very condemning tone about superstition and things like that, especially when it harms people directly. And when you look at this behavior of doing that, you have to ask yourself, well, why are we so concerned about rationality and reason and all that? And the reason we're concerned about it is because of the good that it can do for human beings, for all beings, really. But um, because rationality and reason and a humble approach to knowledge are powerful tools that help us, that's why we value them. So what that indicates is that there's a more primal value here that's on a more foundational level, and that value is compassion. So really, the beginning of all humanism starts with compassion, because if we didn't care what happened to other people, or we didn't care what happened to humanity or a fellow human being, we wouldn't. Then rationality wouldn't be that important to us. So reason and rationality and all that, empiricism and science, those are only important because we have compassion. So if we realize that that priority structure exists, then we need to really be practicing humanism in that priority structure. Meaning that we need to be putting compassion first. And when we start talking about humanism, the first thing should be compassion. Uh, and that's the thinking behind the beginnings of the humanist contemplative perspective.
Now, you've got the Humanist Contemplative group, and I want you there's a little bit of a connection story here from what I'm seeing in your bio, is that your Humanist Contemplative group and concept has since helped inspire a similar group at Harvard. And interestingly enough, a few weeks prior to this, we had a great conversation with Rick Heller, who's part of that group, and that's the Harvard Humanism group, I believe. Is there a little bit of a background story there? How did that occur?
Well, Rick Heller is a really great guy. We've interacted quite a bit online, and I've met him once at the uh, the last humanist convention. And uh, he runs that group, and it's part of the humanist chaplaincy at Harvard.
Greg
And,
Epstein's group.
correct. And so basically, I was just kind of doing my thing, writing my stuff, uh, you know, had my site going and everything. And um, Rick could probably give you more detail on his end of it, but from what I understand, he had come across my site and been a reader, and so wanted to do something along similar thought process there. So they started a humanist contemplative group there. Um, and he told me that influenced their group getting started. I was really happy to hear that. I'd love to see more humanist contemplative groups start elsewhere. And I think he calls it the humanist mindfulness group now because he really wants to focus on mindfulness. Um, and it's another part of the humanist contemplative idea is that we bring in things like meditation and um, traditional or not traditional, but teachings from a lot of different philosophies, what have you. So yeah, that's pretty much all there is to it. I think he was inspired by that idea or that concept, and I should also mention something that's kind of ironic. The I was thinking along these lines, when I came up with the concept of the humanist contemplative, but I didn't have a name for it yet. I didn't really know what to call it, and that's when I read Sam Harris's The End of Faith. Now, Sam Harris, he has a reputation of being, one of the
Four
new,
Horsemen.
yeah, exactly, the new atheist, very harsh against religion and all that kind of stuff, and I guess he is, but he also he has a appreciation for Buddhism, um, uh, and talks about benefits of attention practice and things like that. Well, toward the end of his book, most of the end of faith is, of course, talking about the dangers of religion and everything, and he's more hardline on that than I generally prefer. I think he's a good writer, but I think his focus is different than mine, of course. But near the end, he talks about how what we really need is a contemplative line of thought uh, that's I think he might have said atheism or something like that, but the key word is contemplative. And so
Yep, yep.
his use of that word is pretty much what made a light go off in my head. I said, yeah, there's the name I've been looking for because it's exactly what I'm doing. So
Yeah, it's interesting. I also read and enjoyed that book, and he's been a meditator for many years, and he was very involved in Buddhist practices, and still posts and gets some flack for it on his blog. I think it was about half a year ago he had posted one about Vipassana meditation, and he was very open about what it was and where it was from. And I one of the things I respect about Sam is that he doesn't try to hide or obfuscate that there are valuable, beneficial practices that we can get. We shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater just because it is from a context of a religious tradition. And that's what, and that's despite, the rest of the book, which had to do with religion is bad, religion is bad. Oh, but here's this thing, which is kind of good. I'm like, well, and so I've asked many times, and I did get a response once saying, I'm kind of busy right now, but yeah, that sounds good. Because what we're trying to do here and what you're doing and what Rick is involved with is the attempt to energize and propagate this idea that you can have a non-religious, if you want to call it secular or spiritual or whatever you want to, however you want to label it, whatever the reference you want to make to it, it's in the same theme of having a contemplative practice that integrates with whatever kind of life that you have, that it's a human thing. It's not something based on, but you must accept these religious assertions in order to be a good fill in the blank. You don't have that. It respects individual forms of practice.
You know what's interesting about the criticisms that come from a lot of atheists on this is that a lot of the atheists and humanists in the West don't realize just how Christianized their understanding of religion is, or how Abrahamized, maybe you might put it. In that, for example, I growing up as a Christian, I always thought of religion before as things you believe. And if you look at the Humanist Manifesto, it even kind of comes out of that same mindset. They say in there that humanism is a life stance. Okay. Well, that's just okay. So I believe this. That's it. And then it just ends there. But the idea of Buddhism and other things like Stoicism and Stoicism is Western philosophy, but it's kind of the nexus between the two. And, a lot of other ancient philosophies had to do with living the philosophy and putting it into practice and very specific practices designed to um, affect how we live our lives and affect our character and our inner state and our well-being and our contentment and happiness. These are very pragmatic, practical things that you can apply. And that notion of that element in a religion was kind of foreign to me. And I won't say that there's nothing like that in Christianity, but Christianity at its core, at least as it's practiced and talked about in this century, is about accepting a certain idea that Jesus is Savior and accepting Him as your Savior and that sort of thing. And then that's it. You're saved, and there's not really set practices designed to improve your life here and now, other than getting blessings and praying and that sort of thing from another.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it has to do with acceptance, not practice. And although
Right.
I would,
It's more what you do rather than what you believe.
right, and that's one of the things that we face on a regular basis is that some of the criticisms we have on the receiving end of secular Buddhism typically comes from folks who don't really have an understanding of what it is. They haven't asked. They level a judgment and say, "Oh, well, that's just ridiculous," or have some criticism that has a little more merit and meat to it. But again, it's leveled without an open and free inquiry, asking people who do it, "Hey, I don't understand this. I don't know. That's an honest and sincere and friendly thing to say. We don't need to be jerks about this kind of thing, and we can ask about them.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm seeing that that's been getting much better this past year. That some of the online discussions have been much more companionable and less antagonistic, which is nice to see.
Yeah, I think things are changing, and I think, that you really can't blame people for not understanding Buddhism because people over here, because it's really a difficult thing. You're talking about an ancient philosophy that is covered with layers of cultural colorings. You've got problems with translations between very different languages. Sometimes the translations don't quite do the job, and they end up sounding more mystical than they really are. So you've got a lot of challenges there to really get across the ideas to people. And so that's why what you guys are doing is so important, because you're really building, um, you're part of this process of building a Western Buddhism that doesn't require as much work translating. And I don't mean just translating language, but translating mindsets, and connects with people over here so that they can get it, so that it clicks and they, oh yeah, okay, now. And things get in our way too, like the word religion. I kind of decided, I don't know, a year or two ago, that I'm going to try to stop using that word very much, because it really is kind of meaningless. So many people have a different idea of what religion is. And, a lot of the critics of religion, what they're really criticizing are certain specific elements. They're criticizing things like intolerance or dogma or ideology or violence or blind faith, or, those kinds of things are what they're criticizing. Sometimes even things out a layer from that, like inequalities and stuff like that. And really, those are the things that we need to tackle. And when somebody says religion, you don't know whether they're talking about a social structure or a set of dogmas or what. And so it really is kind of meaningless. I've just decided pretty much that, you just leave that up to individuals, whether they want to consider their belief system or their practice a religion or not. And I don't worry about it. If somebody wants to call it a religion or not a religion, whatever. What's important is the content, and what kind of principles we're following.
That's, one of the postings that I put up on our Facebook page in the past couple of days as a graphic, and I'm looking at it right now, was your beliefs don't make you a better person, your behavior does.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I like that. Let's take a sidestep on a couple of things. One is, let's talk for a moment about secular humanism and free inquiry. I know, as a magazine that is a secular humanist magazine, for those of you who are not familiar with it. And the Humanist Manifesto is printed in every issue. I think it's on the inside front cover. It's a good magazine. And one of the things that Paul Kurtz, who was one of the founders of this organization that puts it out, every now and then I had noticed in issues past, in the past few years, that Paul has mentioned that, we say really good stuff about here's what you should do. Be excellent to each other. It's essentially the message, to borrow from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Be excellent to each other. But he says that what we really need as secular humanists is a way to help people actually do that. And what are your thoughts on maybe contemplative practices filling that role?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly down the line of what I've been working on. And I've been working on it in a number of different channels, so to speak. First of all, the concept of the humanist contemplative is kind of a starting point. That's bringing in these concepts and practices, more importantly, from Buddhism, and but also from a number of other uh, effective traditions and philosophies. And that's one phase of it. There's also another thing I'm working on. There's three of these that are kind of going in parallel. There's that one, and then there's another thing that I'm working on, which is probably going to be a book by the time it's finished, and I'm calling it Synthophy. Uh, that's Synthophy, and basically what I've noticed is that uh, Joseph Campbell had that concept of the monomyth. Well, this is kind of like a monopath. And what I've noticed is that there are um, there are certain similarities between, let's take the two biggies that I've been really comparing, which is Stoicism and Buddhism. Stoicism in the West, Buddhism in the East. And it's more than just similarities. There's actually a certain way of approaching the world, way of approaching life that it's almost like if you imagine there's this one path and it's kind of a windy path. And the Buddhists came through and they put signs along that path saying, you
Yeah.
are here, you are here, you are here, and directing you to the next sign. And then the Stoics came along and they put up their own signs, but they put them at different spots in the path. And so you kind of move in the same general direction, but it's kind of like if you imagine this big list of all of the elements of this path, the Buddhist might, their views, they might emphasize numbers 1, 3, 5, 8, 10, 12, and those are kind of their main things. And then the Stoics emphasize 1, 7, 14, whatever. But when you can put all this together in a synthesized kind of way, um, and of course, while I'm kind of weaving these things together like this and putting them into common terms, like they obviously have very different terminologies, and they'll stop at the edge of one idea in a different place and beginning it in another. And so I'm trying to put these in consistent one single terminologies and ways of translating and talking about these things in a unified lexicon. And the end result is going to be this basic outline that is very easy reading and very, very plain language and very easy to understand step by step process of this path. And what this path is basically is, you could take all of the different philosophies and traditions and religions of the world, and you could categorize them in one of two columns based on how they uh, how they handle impermanence. Um, we all look around us and we see there's impermanence everywhere, and it's a source of a lot of aggravation. Friends die, loved ones die, jobs go away, reputations are ruined, all kinds of different things happen, and things come and go, health comes and goes. And it seems, you're looking around, you see everything changes constantly. There's this birth and you know that. But the key thing is, how do we deal with it? Now, in the one column, you've got the religions and the philosophies, and their approach to dealing with this is to say, don't worry about it. There really is something permanent and everlasting and unchanging that you can hitch your hopes to. You can't see it, maybe, or maybe it's hard to see or whatever, but it does exist. And maybe that's an afterlife or a God or a savior or some other kind of, maybe even it's something secular, like a singularity or something like that. Um, and so that's the one approach. You're going to say, we're going to try to place our hopes in this thing that we think really is permanent. The second approach are all of those philosophies and religions um, which instead say, yes, everything changes, everything's impermanent, including you, and here's how you can come to terms with it, live in harmony with it, and be happier that you've done so. Um, and that really is kind of the approach of Buddhism, but it's also the approach of Stoicism. And there's these common traits of all of these philosophies that take that approach. And so that's the second kind of thing I've got going. I'm not sure when that'll be out or whatever. I've been working on it for a few years. I'm getting kind of close. That's one particular take on a spiritual naturalistic, approach. There's many other ways to mix this formula, but this is one particular one. And then the third thing I'm working on is something a lot more general, and that is I'm working right now to found an organization, a nonprofit organization called the Spiritual Naturalist Society. And the Spiritual Naturalist Society is basically the idea behind it is that there's a movement happening right now, and it's taking place in all of the traditional ways that we pigeonhole people. The Jews have a more of a naturalistic part of their spectrum. The Buddhists have naturalists in them. The humanists are all naturalists, but they also have an end of the spectrum that's very secular, and they want to just have philosophy meetings. And then there's another group that are more of the religious humanists, which are moving into spiritual kind of direction, even though their beliefs are naturalistic. And then there's pagans that are moving in this naturalistic understanding of paganism. So, and many others. And so, in all of these groups, they all have an end of the spectrum within their traditions that are moving in a manner that's seeking to reunite the sacred and the natural. That's seeking to look at the natural universe as we understand it in modern times and have a spirituality that's compatible with that. So the Spiritual Naturalist Society is going to cut across familiar boundaries and bring people together who are from all of these different traditions. And that's why I use the term spiritual naturalism. And that organization will exist to help spread awareness of spiritual naturalism, whether it's naturalistic Buddhism or humanistic paganism or all of these different varieties, naturalistic Stoicism. And so it's going to exist to help spread awareness of those things, awareness of those practices, things like meditation and journaling and negative visualization, which is a practice that comes out of Stoicism, all kinds of different things like that. And also, secondly, the mission of that organization will be to help bring together people and form a community of interacting people where they can share ideas and help really develop this emerging thing of this spiritual naturalism, and regardless of what traditions they come from. And I'm hoping that organizations like yours and other like-minded organizations from all kinds of different backgrounds would like to be partner organizations and work together on a lot of things.
Well, and that's one of the main things I think that you're very good in contributing to this dialogue is making aware that it's okay for you to have a naturalistic attitude and still find a practice that you find uplifting in a way that we would, in traditional sense, call spiritual, and we don't mean it in a supernatural way. We mean it in a perfectly naturalistic way. That's all right, and that's something that I hear from people every week, sending in emails that are saying, thank you for doing this, because I thought this wasn't something I could do. It wasn't okay to not believe in some of the assertions that are made because I can't believe in them, but I still really, really have a very strong and meaningful transformation and sense of uplifting of an uplifting mind and heart when I do this practice. And I know it's perfectly normal. It's biological stuff, but it's still very hard to explain to other people. And I think you're helping open that door and let people know that it's okay to do that.
Yeah, and one of the things behind this is to just jump in, because there was so much of this that I saw being talked about even years back. I mean, people inside the American Humanist Association have written articles talking about uh, a need for a sacred sort of language for naturalists, and but it's all it's there's a lot of interesting conversation, but I just decided, well, I'm going to stop having these debates about whether or not it's okay to use the word spiritual or this or that. I'm just going to dive in and do it.
Take action. Yep.
Let's just do it. Let's make the organization. Let's start. I want this organization and your organization and any organizations that are involved in this to be think tanks, to be the tools which actually do the work of founding a new path, forging a new path where the natural and the sacred can really be reunited. Because I think what's happened in the past is that sometime in the past, when you read ancient philosophy, it's pretty clear that a lot of those guys are really talking about nature or the natural universe as they understand how it works. And there was a sense of the sacred in that. The philosophers of ancient Greece, they were more like a monk in the way that they would live and be an example to people and talk about ethics and virtue and all this stuff. There weren't anything like a philosopher of today in academia. They were,
Right.
they applied it in their life. And what happened was that at some point along the way, we had this split where we imagined there was this supernatural realm that was unknowable, untouchable. It was like another dimension. And we took everything of value and meaning and purpose and awe and wonder, and we threw it in that black hole, and we threw it over in that other category. And which was fine if you actually believed that black hole had something in it. But then what's happened is that worked for us throughout, a long period of time. But now we're coming into this period of secularization where a lot of people are leaving their traditional faiths because they don't necessarily believe those narratives anymore, and they have different standards for knowledge now. And now what's happening is all of that valuable stuff that was in that other column is getting chopped off and thrown away. And of course, you're going to feel meaningless and you're going to feel like there's nothing of value anymore because all of the good stuff has been chopped away. And so, what we need to do is we need to get back to that original mindset where the natural universe is the sacred universe. They're one and the same. There's not a dualism, it's one thing. And that's the viewpoint that the Stoics had. It's the viewpoint that the Taoists had, which affected Buddhist thought, which interacted with Buddhist thought. It's the perspective that people like Carl Sagan and Albert Einstein, when they talked about the nature that they studied as scientists, they had that feel, that perspective on it. And that's the kind of direction I think that we're going to see more of in the future.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I had just yesterday sent out a revised paper that I'd put together for a special edition that's coming up of the Journal of Global Buddhism. They're doing a special issue on secular Buddhism. And part of what I wrote in this paper, and I see this quoted again and again all over the place on Buddhist blogs, the Pew survey and the Eris survey that says the largest growing designation is Buddhists. I'm like, no, that's not quite accurate. The largest religious, quotey fingers, designation might be growing is Buddhists, but that's typically less than 0.3 of the big branches of Buddhism. The largest and fastest growing delineation of how do you call yourself is people declaring no religion whatsoever. And that includes the atheists and agnostics and people who are religious but not any particular. They're just not ascribing to traditional religions. That's the largest and fastest growing group, by far 20 times more than the Buddhist groups. So when you talk about there is a very large opportunity and that this is going to be growing, absolutely. Statistically, we can verify this through these kinds of surveys that show that this is becoming a more secular society. That does not mean that people don't still need some of the help and guidance in what to do in their lives that in the past, traditionally, to use that word, has been in the realm of religion. I think that can exist as a practice that's well within the naturalistic realm, and that's part of what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the numbers that you mentioned there about the growth of secularism, you know, the atheist groups and a lot of people in the humanist groups are looking at that number with glee, and they're thinking, "Yay, we're getting more people and
More
everything."
of us, go us,
And
yeah.
right, and they're very excited about it. But I'm kind of cautious about it because, um, I like to point out when I point out the difference between atheism and humanism, for example, that there's all kinds of atheists. Just because you don't believe in God doesn't mean you're a saint or whatever. Boy, that's a weird
Yeah,
sentence.
that's it.
But you know what
I'm
I
going to
mean.
quote you on that one. Note to self, the quote of this one occurred at 57 minutes in.
Yeah, that's pretty ironic. Okay, well, anyway, my point is just because you don't believe in God doesn't mean anything else about you in particular. Joseph Stalin was, in fact, an atheist, and so you can have all kinds of horrible atheists, um, and you can also have very good atheists. So the thing that I'm concerned about is that, we've got all these people, and they're basically just kind of like falling off the back of a truck in a huge pile. And what's happening is, and I think the internet is largely to be credited for this, but blamed depending on your perspective.
Blamed as well.
But
Culprit.
it's hard to, it required a lot of isolation before to have very, very uh, fundamentalist kind of upbringing, and now you've got people. The exchange of information is just such where it's hard for you not to compare these different beliefs and think, well, none of these guys really, why should I pick one over the other? So that's obviously a big driving force in this secularism. But as it happens, what I'm concerned about is that there is such a thing for naturalists as a lost soul. There is such a thing as a person who um, their whole life is about uh, iPhones and Walmart, or their whole life is about,
What we might consider fairly shallow activities and goals and
right, and materialism, not in the sense of, naturalism, but materialism in the sense of being materialistic. And, those things are not going to, a lot of these people coming into the secular group are young people, and probably most of them. And as they get older and they go through the different phases in life and these generation ages, they're going to find that that is not a very good serving set of principles for them.
it's not going to bring them happiness, right?
Right. And what I'm concerned about is that when they reach that inevitable point where they're looking for meaning, are we going to see a backlash, a return to an even more conservative, like another 1980s,
Yeah,
basically?
yeah, yeah.
Because that's what happened in the 80s. All the hippies basically turned into Rush Limbaughs, and I don't know how or why that's so weird, but it's phases of life, And if you don't have any other alternative but to go down to the local Baptist church or whatever it is, and next thing you know, you're voting against gay rights and stuff. So all these things are interconnected. And we're going to see that, and I kind of think that backlash factor will not be as extreme this time, but I do think that it is something that could happen, and that what we need to do in the meantime is be building a really credible, useful, practical, and fulfilling um, path, a spiritual path that people can use without giving up their rationality.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. That is part of the reason that I started this podcast, is to make sure that there's an understanding that you're an atheist, you're agnostic, you're a naturalist, you're any number of things that is more interested in demonstrable explanations of what we see in day-to-day existence, That doesn't mean you're not passionate. It doesn't mean you're not inspired. It doesn't mean you don't have a really rich life that seeks meaning that we make for ourselves. We don't need to get externally, and that can't drive you to great and wonderful heights. Sure it does. And I think this time around, what we'll see are a couple of differences. First, there are lots of people who are working to make available this kind of option and open these kinds of doors. And second, we have a very big advantage in technologies, in social networking, to make sure that people don't have to slip through a net that may not have existed in the past. Now we have the advantage of things like Facebook and Twitter and websites and podcasts and all the rest of these things that help people connect with others who are like-minded. And we keep running into folks every day who stumble across us or find us through links in other blogs or something like that. And that's one reason why we do outreach and interactions with, say, the secular humanists and the atheist groups and others to open up those doors, because everyone's going to engage with the practice a little bit differently. What I do will be a little bit different than what you do, and that's okay. we can value and cherish that diversity of personal practice.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that that's the one thing that I'm really excited about with the Spiritual Naturalist Society is I'm not asking people to come be some other thing. I want it to be like a multidiscipline community where, the Buddhists will have important things to offer, but so will the pagans, and so will the humanists, and so will, the Stoics and all these other people. But there's a number of organizations that are doing really neat things. You guys, of course, the Secular Buddhist Association, one of the most exciting ones. There's the Humanistic Paganism, which is a blog. You sound like you're familiar with it. They have some interesting things going on there. The Charter for Compassion, I think, is just an incredible, and they're even broader. They include religious people and spiritual people and traditional religions and that sort of thing. There's also the Center for Naturalism, the Center
Tom Clark's group.
Right, Tom Clark, and he was early guy getting out there with the whole naturalism thing, and he has a page on his site talking about naturalistic spirituality. The Center for Contemplative Mind and Society seems really exciting too. They're really distilling those contemplative ideas and practices.
Mm-hmm. So we have our work cut out for us, clearly.
Yeah. And, all this that we've discussed so far, and we haven't even really, talked in depth about any one of these practices yet. This is all just, formative kind of stuff about where we go from here. But just for the listener's sake, there's just a wealth of really good information about elements and pieces and practices to incorporate into a life practice that are just incredibly powerful at achieving the good life or the flourishing life.
So what we've been talking about and who we've been talking with is D.T. Strain. And folks, if you want to, and I would encourage you to do this because it's got a really cool website with links to a lot of things we've been talking about here. His website is humanistcontemplative.org. Daniel, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. And I would just ask if anybody's interested in this upcoming new organization too, the Spiritual Naturalist Society, that you can also go to spiritualnaturalistsociety.org. And there's nothing there yet. It's kind of a coming soon deal, but you can put in your email if you want to get updates.
That sounds great. And actually, Daniel, if you come back and talk with us as that progresses, because I'd like to hear more.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been great.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.